At my stepmother's charity gala, I was gasping for air when she shoved a dirty rag into my chest and snapped, "Enough drama! Get in the kitchen and clean up your mess." My father sneered, telling me to stop embarrassing him. Then a doctor, grabbed my wrist. Her face went pale. "Call 911, she yelled. For 1 second, the ballroom went dead silent, then absolute panic exploded. I am Natalie, 34 years old, and until that night, I thought I knew exactly how cruel my family could be. I grew up as the forgotten scapegoat in a sprawling Winnetka, Illinois mansion, always pushed into the shadows, while my stepmother Patricia and her entitled daughter Brittany took center stage. I never told them I secretly built a multi-million-dollar medical supply company on my own. They thought of me as their pathetic punching bag. Before I continue, let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever survived a toxic family. The evening of Patricia's annual charity dinner was supposed to be a triumph for my father, Richard. His regional medical distribution company was allegedly booming, and Patricia transformed their estate into a lavish spectacle of crystal chandeliers, imported orchids, and expensive catering. I was not invited as a guest. Patricia demanded I work the event, forcing me into a cheap uniform to serve champagne. She claimed it was the least I could do to repay them for putting a roof over my head when I was a teenager. I was carrying a heavy silver tray piled high with empty flutes toward the kitchen when my chest tightened. The air grew thin and a sharp wheeze rattled deep inside my throat. I tried to reach into my apron pocket for my rescue inhaler, but the unbalanced weight of the tray kept my hands occupied. My vision blurred. I stumbled blindly, bumping into the sharp edge of a marble table. The tray slipped from my grasp, sending dozens of crystal glasses shattering across the hardwood floor. The crash brought the entire party to a sudden halt. Elegant guests turned to stare. I dropped to my knees, clutching my throat, trying to pull oxygen into my burning lungs. Patricia marched right through the parted crowd, her face flushed with fury. She wore a crimson gown that swept across the floor, her designer heels clicking aggressively as she approached my struggling body. She did not kneel down to check my breathing. She did not ask if I was okay. Instead, she ruthlessly grabbed a damp towel from a catering station and threw it directly at my face. "Quit faking it, Natalie," Patricia hissed maliciously. "You have been faking these pathetic coughs since you were 10 years old just to get out of doing your chores. Grow up. Get back in the kitchen, grab a broom, and clean this mess up immediately before someone important steps on a jagged shard of glass." I looked up weakly, my vision swimming desperately, searching the room for my biological father. Richard stood merely a few feet away, casually holding a glass of expensive scotch. He looked directly down at me with pure disgust. "Stop being so lazy," he muttered harshly, adjusting his silk tie. "You are embarrassing me in front of my investors. Get off the floor right this second and do your job." I tried frantically to speak, to tell them my inhaler was empty and my airway was closing, but only a wet, suffocating gasp came out. Dark spots danced at the edges of my fading vision. I felt cold sweat pouring down my neck. The affluent guests simply stood and watched, murmuring quietly amongst themselves, taking their emotional cues directly from my unbothered parents. To them, I was just an unstable employee ruining a high-class event. Suddenly, a young woman forcefully pushed her way through the dense crowd of onlookers. It was Savannah Reed. She was 32, a brilliant board-certified physician, and unfortunately one of Brittany's closest friends from medical school. Unlike the rest of my horrible family, Savannah possessed a strong moral compass. She dropped to her bare knees right in the middle of the broken glass, ignoring the sharp shards tearing into her expensive evening gown. She grabbed my trembling wrist securely, her experienced fingers pressing firmly against my fading pulse. The polite dinner guest vanished, completely replaced by a terrified medical professional saving a life. Savannah looked at Patricia, her firm voice echoing through the silent room. "She is not faking. She is experiencing severe tracheal anaphylaxis. Her airway is completely closing." Savannah turned aggressively to the shocked crowd, screaming at the top of her lungs. "Someone call 911 right now. She is turning blue." The massive room froze instantly. The background music stopped entirely. No one moved for a fraction of a second. Then absolute chaos erupted. Panicked catering staff dropped their silver trays. Terrified guests began shouting and scrambling for their mobile phones. Savannah ripped open the tight collar of my cheap uniform shirt, tilting my heavy head back to open my swelling airway, frantically barking instructions to the horrified people rapidly gathering around us. My exhausted body went entirely limp against the cold hardwood floor. The agonizing burn in my failing lungs gave way to a deeply cold numbness. The loud voices swarming around me suddenly began to sound like they were deep underwater, distorted and fading fast. Through the creeping darkness, I could hear the distant wail of ambulance sirens rapidly approaching the gated estate. But right before the heavy darkness managed to swallow me completely, the very last distinct sound that registered inside my failing brain was Patricia's cold voice cutting through the unfolding medical panic with absolute chilling clarity. If she ruins my expensive custom carpets with this little stunt, I am billing her for every single penny. That was the moment I realized they would gladly let me die just to save their party. The harsh fluorescent lights of the intensive care unit pierced through my heavy eyelids. I woke up to the rhythmic beeping of a heart monitor, my throat raw and burning like swallowed glass. The room was sterile, cold, and entirely empty. No flowers sat on the bedside table. No worried father paced the floor. No stepsister pretended to care. Just me tangled in a web of wires exactly the way I had spent every childhood hospital visit. A nurse pushed through the heavy wooden door, her rubber-soled shoes squeaking against the linoleum. She carried a clear plastic bag containing my ruined catering uniform and a single folded piece of thick stationery paper. She looked at me with a mixture of pity and professional detachment. "Your family did not stay," the nurse said softly, setting the plastic bag at the foot of my bed. "A woman claiming to be your mother dropped this off at the front desk before the ambulance even arrived at the hospital. She said it was urgent." I reached for the thick paper, recognizing Patricia's custom-embossed monogram immediately. My hands trembled slightly as I unfolded it. It was a formal, itemized invoice. The total at the bottom sat in bold black ink: $4,500. The description read, "Event disruption hazard cleanup and imported Persian carpet restoration." Beneath the total, Patricia had written a swift, jagged note: "Pay this immediately, or I am suing you for lost charity donations. Do not ever show your face at my club again." I stared at the invoice. My lungs had completely collapsed. I had nearly died on her dining room floor, and her only concern was the carpet. A bitter laugh scraped its way up my raw throat. The nurse rushed forward, placing a gentle hand on my shoulder. "You need to rest," she urged, her eyes full of genuine concern. "You suffered acute respiratory failure. You were completely unconscious for 2 days. 2 days." I pushed the thin hospital blankets off my legs, ignoring the sharp pull of the IV line taped to the back of my hand. "I do not have 2 days to waste," I told her, swinging my bare legs over the side of the bed. "I need to pay my hospital copay and get out of here right now. I have a business to run." The nurse tried to protest, warning me about the severe dangers of leaving against medical advice, but I was already pulling on my civilian clothes. The cold reality of my family's cruelty was the only adrenaline I needed. 10 minutes later, I stood at the main hospital billing desk, leaning heavily against the high counter to steady my shaking legs. I slid my corporate black card across the glass partition. "I need to settle my account for room 312, I told the young clerk. She typed my name and social security number into the system. Almost immediately, her face drained of color. She stared at the computer monitor, her fingers freezing over the keyboard. A bright red error box flashed visibly on her screen. "Please wait here," she stammered, grabbing her desk phone and turning her back to me. She whispered frantically into the receiver. Less than a minute later, a man in a sharp gray suit marched out from the back offices. He carried a thick manila folder and possessed the grim, tightened expression of someone delivering terrible news. "Ms. Natalie," he said, his voice dropping to a discreet, serious volume. "I am Marcus Sterling, the hospital administrator. Please step into my office immediately. We cannot process your payment. I grabbed my credit card, my frustration mounting. If this is about the network coverage, I can write a check right now. Mr. Sterling shook his head, holding the door to his office open. This has nothing to do with network coverage. Please sit down. I took a seat in the stiff leather chair opposite his desk. Mr. Sterling sat down heavily, dropping the thick manila folder right between us. Your insurance provider did not decline your copay, he stated flatly. They froze your entire identity profile. Federal investigators placed a hard lock on your social security number 48 hours ago. I stared at him, my exhaustion instantly vanishing. Federal investigators, why? Mr. Sterling opened the folder, flipping through dozens of highly detailed spreadsheets. According to the National Healthcare Registry, you have been claiming millions of dollars in severe respiratory equipment for the past 5 years. Ventilators, industrial oxygen tanks, specialized asthma nebulizers. The system shows you receiving weekly freight deliveries of commercial-grade medical supplies. That is completely impossible. I shot back, gripping the armrests of my chair. I buy my emergency inhalers out of pocket because my father cut me off his insurance policy when I turned 18. I have never ordered commercial medical equipment in my life. I run a private company. Mr. Sterling slid a stack of invoices across the polished mahogany desk. Someone has, he corrected sharply, and they have been billing Medicare and private insurers using your lifelong asthma diagnosis as the foundational medical necessity. They weaponized your chronic illness to create a massive, untraceable paper trail. Over $2 million has been defrauded under your name. You are currently the primary suspect in a federal investigation. The air in the small office suddenly felt non-existent. My mind raced backwards, slamming into puzzle pieces I had ignored for years. Patricia holding onto my birth certificate and social security card long after I moved out. Richard insisting I use his company's internal doctor for my annual asthma checkups. Brittany mocking me for my cheap inhalers while driving a brand new sports car. They had not been trying to manage my health. They had been farming my medical data. I reached out and pulled the stack of fraudulent invoices closer. The billing headers were attached to a third-party shell company called Apex Respiratory Solutions. I scanned the corporate registration details printed at the very bottom of the page. The address listed was 405 West Grand Avenue, Suite 100. My blood ran completely cold. It was not a random warehouse. It was the exact corporate address of my father's failing regional medical distribution company. The same father who had stood over my gasping body 2 days ago and called me lazy. They had not just neglected me, they had stolen my identity to fund their lavish lifestyle, and they were planning to let me take the fall for a massive federal crime. The tires of my car screeched against the polished concrete of the parking garage at 405 West Grand Avenue. I barely put the vehicle in park before shoving the door open, the thick manila folder from Marcus Sterling clutched tightly against my chest. My lungs still burned with every breath I took. My throat felt like rough sandpaper from the emergency intubation tube, but the hot rage coursing through my veins completely overrode the lingering physical pain. I marched through the double-glass doors of Richard's corporate headquarters, ignoring the startled receptionist who called out my name. I knew exactly where I was going. I threw open the heavy mahogany doors to the executive suite. Richard sat behind his massive desk, casually practicing his golf putt into a small, automated cup on the floor. His office was a monument to unearned arrogance, decorated with expensive leather furniture, imported abstract art, and framed photographs of himself shaking hands with local politicians. He did not even flinch when the heavy doors slammed violently against the walls. He simply checked his posture, tapped the golf ball, and watched it sink into the mechanical hole before finally looking up at me. "You look terrible, Natalie," he said smoothly, leaning the putter against his desk. "If you are here to complain about Patricia's carpet invoice, you can turn around and leave. She had to hire a specialized crew from Chicago to lift those stains. You should pay it immediately and apologize for causing such an unnecessary scene at her event." I marched across the plush rug and slammed the hospital billing documents directly over his leather desk pad. I am not here about a carpet, I snapped, planting my hands firmly on the edge of his desk. I am here about Apex Respiratory Solutions. I am here about the $2 million in fraudulent Medicare claims filed under my Social Security number. Richard glanced down at the papers. His expression remained entirely blank. He did not show a single ounce of panic, surprise, or guilt. He simply sighed, picked up the folder, and tossed it carelessly into a wire tray on the corner of his desk. It is a simple administrative error, he said dismissively, walking over to his private wet bar to pour himself a glass of sparkling water. Our accounting department must have accidentally merged your old medical files with a commercial client account. I will have them correct the coding by the end of the quarter. Just ignore it and go home. Ignore it, I repeated, my voice rising in disbelief. Federal investigators have flagged my identity. They think I am running a black market medical supply ring. You used my chronic asthma, the exact same asthma you and Patricia ignored for 2 decades, to bill the government for industrial ventilators. You are going to call the feds right now and confess, or I am driving straight to the FBI field office. Before Richard could answer, the office doors swung open again. Brittany strolled in, weighed down by 3 massive Chanel shopping bags. She wore a pristine white blazer and diamond earrings that caught the mid-morning sunlight. She stopped dead in her tracks when she saw me, her perfectly manicured hand flying to her mouth in mock horror. "Good grief, Natalie!" Brittany laughed, dropping her heavy shopping bags onto a leather sofa. "Did you sleep in a dumpster? You look like you just crawled out of a crypt." "I just crawled out of the intensive care unit," I replied coldly, "where you all left me to die." Brittany rolled her eyes dramatically, waving her hand in the air. "Stop playing the victim. You ruined my mother's charity gala with your little panic attack, and now you are here harassing Dad at work." She walked over to Richard, wrapping her arms around his shoulders and kissing his cheek. "Dad is running a major corporation. He does not have time for your delusions. He has time to steal my identity," I shot back. Brittany scoffed loudly, crossing her arms over her chest. "Why would anyone want to steal your pathetic identity? You have absolutely nothing. Dad's company pays for my lifestyle, not yours. We are dealing with multi-million-dollar hospital contracts, Natalie. You are barely scraping by. Why do you not just go back to your little online hustle and let the real adults handle business?" I stared at my stepsister. She genuinely believed her own arrogance. She thought I was still the broke, desperate teenager they kicked out years ago. She assumed my online hustle was some pathetic freelance trap. She had absolutely no idea that Aegis Med Supply, the multinational conglomerate currently dominating the North American medical tech market, was entirely mine. She did not know that my company's quarterly tax payments dwarfed her father's entire net worth. I kept my expression completely neutral. I was not going to reveal my hand yet. Not when they were digging their own graves so perfectly. "You are right, Brittany," I said softly, staring directly into Richard's eyes. "You are dealing with multi-million-dollar contracts, which makes $2 million in Medicare fraud a very interesting risk to take. Why steal using my name unless this company is completely broke?" Richard slammed his water glass down on the wet bar. The crystal cracked loudly against the marble counter. "Watch your tone in my office," he growled, the polished facade finally slipping to reveal the vicious bully underneath. "You owe this family everything. Your mother left you nothing but hospital bills and a weak pair of lungs. I kept a roof over your head. If my accounting department made a clerical mistake, you will keep your mouth shut and let us fix it internally." The tense silence in the room was suddenly broken by the sound of rapid, heavy footsteps approaching from the hallway. Jamal, Brittany's husband, burst into the executive suite. He did not bother knocking. As the brilliant financial risk analyst they kept on paper to look diverse, but secretly treated like a subordinate, he usually maintained a calm demeanor. Today he looked physically ill. His immaculate suit was wrinkled, his tie loosened, and sweat beaded on his forehead. He clutched a thick stack of red-flagged financial printouts. Jamal froze when he saw me standing there, his eyes darting nervously between Richard, Brittany, and myself. "What is it, Jamal?" Richard snapped, clearly irritated by the interruption. "I am dealing with a tantrum here. Jamal swallowed hard completely, ignoring Richard's attempt to deflect. He stepped directly up to the desk, slamming the red flag documents down right next to my fraudulent medical files. "Richard, the bank is calling in the loan," Jamal said, his voice trembling with unchecked panic. "If we do not get Natalie's signature on the trust waiver by Friday, we are foreclosing." The silence in Richard's office was heavy enough to crush bone. Jamal stood near the door, his chest heaving, his eyes locked on the floor. Brittany scoffed, tossing her designer hair over her shoulder, completely oblivious to the gravity of what Jamal had just revealed. Richard, however, physically deflated. The arrogant sneer vanished from his face, instantly replaced by a sickeningly sweet, entirely manufactured fatherly smile. He stepped out from behind his mahogany desk, his hands raised in a gesture of surrender. "Natalie, let us all just take a deep breath," Richard said smoothly, completely ignoring my demands about the federal fraud investigation. He walked toward me, attempting to place a comforting hand on my shoulder. I stepped back, my eyes cold. Richard dropped his hand, his fake smile never wavering. "Jamal is just stressed about the quarterly reports. The bank is simply updating their compliance protocols. But you know what? This is exactly why we need to talk. Not in an office, not like business rivals. As a family." He clapped his hands together, forcing a cheerful tone that made my stomach churn. "Come to the house tonight. Patricia is making a beautiful roast. We will have a proper reconciliation dinner. We will discuss this supposed insurance mix-up, look over whatever trust documents the bank sent over, and fix everything together. Just the five of us." I stared at him. The sheer audacity of his pivot was breathtaking. 2 days ago, he watched me suffocate on his dining room floor. 10 minutes ago, he told me to keep my mouth shut about his company committing federal fraud using my identity. Now he wanted to play the loving patriarch over a home-cooked meal. I knew exactly what he was doing. He was terrified. He needed my signature to save his sinking ship, and he thought he could manipulate me into giving it to him. "I will be there at 7, I said evenly. I turned on my heel and walked out of the office, leaving Brittany complaining about having to cancel her evening spin class. When I arrived at the Winnetka estate that evening, the tension in the dining room was thick enough to choke on. The long mahogany table was set with Patricia's expensive crystal and polished silver. Patricia herself sat at the opposite end, her face pulled tight into a forced, brittle smile. Brittany sat scrolling on her phone, looking profoundly bored. Jamal sat beside her, staring silently at his empty water glass, refusing to make eye contact with me. Richard poured wine with exaggerated enthusiasm, offering toasts to family unity and putting the past behind us. I did not touch my glass. I sat perfectly still, waiting for the inevitable trap to snap shut. I did not have to wait long. Before the main course was even cleared away, Patricia dropped the act. She reached under her chair, pulled out a thick stack of legal documents bound in a blue folder, and shoved it forcefully across the polished wood. It slid to a halt right next to my plate. "Enough of this ridiculous charade," Patricia snapped, her forced smile vanishing. "The bank is being incredibly tedious about an old dormant trust fund your biological mother set up before she passed away. It is tying up our corporate credit lines. We need you to sign this waiver so Richard can restructure his assets and keep this family afloat." I looked down at the blue folder but did not touch it. "I am not signing a waiver for a trust fund I have never even seen," I said calmly. Patricia slammed her hands flat on the table, leaning forward with her teeth bared. "You ungrateful little brat. Your mother left you absolutely nothing but towering hospital bills and a lifetime of medical drama. We are the ones who put a roof over your head. We clothed you. We fed you. We paid for your existence while you contributed nothing. You owe us. Sign the damn paper to pay us back for everything we sacrificed for you." Richard nodded solemnly, playing the reasonable mediator. "It is just a formality, Natalie. The trust has zero liquid cash in it. It is entirely worthless to you. But the bank needs all potential heirs to waive their rights so I can use the family estate as collateral for a new corporate loan. Just sign the last page and we can all move on." I finally reached out and opened the blue folder. They really thought I was stupid. They thought I was still the frightened teenager who blindly followed their orders just to avoid Patricia's wrath. I ignored the cover letter entirely and flipped straight to the middle of the document, scanning the dense legal jargon with the trained eye of a corporate chief executive. My eyes locked onto Schedule B, Section 4. The truth stared back at me in stark black and white ink. This was not a standard financial waiver. There was no money in the trust because the trust was never designed to hold cash. It was an intellectual property holding account. My biological mother, a brilliant respiratory therapist, had spent the last years of her life developing a new kind of oxygen delivery mechanism. I read the specific clauses outlining the transfer of exclusive rights. Richard was not trying to free up a credit line. He was trying to legally steal my mother's patented medical blueprints so his failing distribution company could manufacture them and secure new hospital contracts. He had been using my social security number to funnel fake sales through his shell company to look profitable, but now he needed an actual revolutionary product to save his business from total collapse, and he needed me to hand it over for free. I closed the folder slowly. The room was dead silent, waiting for my compliance. Brittany sighed loudly, tapping her manicured nails on the table. "Just sign the stupid thing so I can leave," she groaned. I picked up the thick legal document in both hands. With one swift, aggressive motion, I ripped the entire stack of papers straight down the middle. Patricia screamed in absolute shock, jumping out of her chair. Richard's face turned purple with instant explosive rage. I dropped the torn halves of the fraudulent contract directly into my half-eaten plate of food. I stood up, pushing my chair back from the table. "I am not signing anything," I said, my voice ringing out with absolute, unshakable authority. "In fact, I am calling the SEC." I left my father staring at the shredded pieces of his fraudulent salvation floating in a pool of expensive gravy. I did not wait for Patricia to start screaming again. I did not stick around to watch Brittany throw a tantrum over her endangered credit cards. I simply walked out of that suffocating Winnetka mansion, climbed into the back of my waiting private town car, and headed straight back to downtown Chicago. My real life was waiting. 40 minutes later, the private elevator doors chimed and parted, depositing me directly into my 6,000-square-foot penthouse. The space was a masterclass in modern architectural design, featuring soaring floor-to-ceiling windows that showcased the glittering, sprawling skyline of the city. Custom art lined the walls, and a massive marble kitchen island anchored the open floor plan. This was the life my family firmly believed I was entirely incapable of achieving. They thought I was shivering in a cramped studio apartment, crying over my failed online hustle. They were so blinded by their own arrogance that they never bothered to look up and see who was actually casting a shadow over them. I walked straight to my home office, poured myself a glass of actual vintage wine, and booted up my highly secure encrypted corporate terminal. I bypassed 3 layers of biometric security and initiated a priority video call. My chief operating officer, David, appeared on the large high-definition screen almost instantly. He did not look happy. He was pacing the length of his own executive office, running a hand nervously through his hair, his tie loosened in visible distress. "Natalie, we have a massive critical problem." David started immediately, holding up a thick red-tabbed briefing dossier to the camera. The Illinois State Hospital Board just closed the final bidding window for the new $20 million respiratory wing contract. We were the absolute clear frontrunners. Our proprietary nebulizer integration was flawless, and our pitch was unmatched. But another firm just dropped a last-minute emergency bid an hour ago. They submitted our exact technical schematics, our exact mechanical blueprints, and they undercut our price point by exactly 15 cents per unit. David stopped pacing and leaned closer to his webcam, his expression grim. "I had our cyber team trace the origin of the submission. The rival company is Apex Respiratory Solutions, your father's distribution firm." I froze completely. The expensive wine glass stopped halfway to my mouth. Apex Respiratory Solutions did not have a research and development department. They barely had a functioning logistics team. For the past decade, Richard had simply bought cheap, outdated, generic medical equipment from overseas and flipped it to underfunded rural clinics at a massive markup. He had absolutely zero capacity, zero engineering talent, and zero capital to engineer the cutting-edge respiratory technology Aegis had spent 3 grueling years perfecting. How on earth did he get his hands on the proprietary schematics? I closed my eyes, my mind racing at light speed through our digital access points, security clearances, and server firewalls. Aegis was locked down tighter than a military vault. There was no way a failing Midwestern distributor hacked our mainframe. Then the realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The old Winnetka family cloud network. When I was 22 years old, still naively, desperately hoping to prove my worth to a father who despised me, I had uploaded my very first round of crude prototype sketches to the shared family server. I had wanted Richard to see my ideas. I wanted him to see my potential. He had ignored the folder completely, calling my designs childish doodles that would never survive in the real corporate world. When I finally cut emotional ties and built my empire, I had locked down my entire existence, but I had completely forgotten to wipe that specific archaic folder from the forgotten home network. Brittany. It had to be Brittany. She had always loved snooping through my digital trash, hoping to find diary entries or embarrassing photos to use as ammunition to mock me. She must have been digging around for something to humiliate me with, stumbled onto the old drive, realized the blueprints matched current high-demand medical market trends, and handed them straight to Richard to save her precious allowance. They probably thought they were brilliant. David was still talking, his voice rising in professional panic. Natalie, this is blatant corporate espionage. We have to file an immediate legal injunction. We need to unleash our litigation team and block the state board from accepting their fraudulent bid. They stole our entire infrastructural design. If Apex wins this $20 million contract using our stolen blueprints, our quarterly projections are completely ruined. We will lose months of projected revenue. I opened my eyes. The initial shock entirely evaporated instantly, replaced by a cold, calculating thrill. I looked at David on the screen. My father and my stepsister thought they were playing a brilliant game of corporate chess. They thought they had finally outsmarted the family failure. They had no idea they had just walked blindly onto a live minefield wearing lead boots. Do not call the legal department, I instructed calmly, taking a slow, deliberate sip of my wine. Do not file a single injunction. Do not attempt to block the bid. David stared at me through the monitor, as if I had suddenly started speaking in a foreign language. Natalie, they maliciously undercut us. The state board is strictly bound by budgetary regulations. They are legally required to accept the lowest matching bid. They are going to award the contract to Apex by tomorrow morning. We have to stop them. I smiled, feeling a deep, dark satisfaction settle heavily into my bones. I know they will award it to Apex. I replied, my voice steady and completely devoid of panic. Let them win the bid. Let them sign the binding state contract. David shook his head, thoroughly confused by my lack of aggression. Why would we hand them a $20 million victory? Because they are greedy, but they are incredibly fundamentally stupid, I explained, leaning forward into the camera frame so David could see the absolute certainty in my eyes. Richard and Brittany stole the design schematics from an old server, but they do not have the manufacturing infrastructure to actually build the machines. They do not have our raw material suppliers. They do not have our specialized exclusive assembly plants in Taiwan. They just promised the state of Illinois $20 million worth of highly advanced medical equipment that they possess absolutely no physical way to manufacture. I watched the realization slowly dawn on David's face as the brilliant brutality of the situation clicked into place. If you default on a state medical contract, the government does not just politely cancel the order. They apply catastrophic daily financial penalties. They freeze your corporate assets. They launch immediate, ruthless federal audits to find out why you failed to deliver life-saving equipment to public hospitals. Richard's company was already drowning in massive debt and facing imminent bank foreclosure. When they failed to deliver the very first shipment of specialized ventilators in 30 days, the state of Illinois will bankrupt them overnight. When they default, I told David, my voice dropping to a deadly quiet register, we trap them. We sit back and wait for the state board to panic over the missing medical supplies. Then Aegis swoops in as the heroic, reliable savior ready to immediately fulfill the urgent order at a premium astronomical emergency markup. We will take the massive contract, and Richard will take the devastating federal penalties. Prepare the manufacturing facilities, David. We are going to let my father completely destroy his own empire. The Oak Brook Country Club was a fortress of exclusionary wealth surrounded by manicured golf greens and aggressive private security. Entering the VIP wellness wing felt like stepping into an alternate reality, one where the devastating consequences of federal fraud simply did not exist. The air inside the private lounge was thick with the scent of crushed eucalyptus, expensive lavender oil, and pure, unfiltered entitlement. I bypassed the marble front desk entirely completely, ignoring the frantic, hushed protests of the spa concierge, and pushed my way directly through the heavy frosted glass doors of the exclusive relaxation atrium. Patricia and Brittany were lounging on pristine white leather chaise lounges beside a cascading indoor waterfall. They wore matching plush monogrammed robes with cool slices of cucumber resting on their eyes, and crystal flutes of imported mimosas balanced in their hands. They looked like the perfect picture of unearned luxury, utterly oblivious to the massive corporate landmine they had just blindly stepped on. I did not yell, I did not throw anything. I simply walked over to their private cabana, picked up the silver ice bucket resting on the table between their lounges, and dumped the freezing water directly onto the heated marble floor, splashing it perfectly across Brittany's designer sandals. Both women shrieked, ripping the cucumbers off their faces. Brittany bolted upright, clutching her robe against her chest. "Are you completely insane?" Brittany screamed. Her face flushed with instant fury as she pulled her ruined shoes away from the puddle. "Who let you in here? This is a private members club. You look like a complete maniac. I want to know exactly what time you logged into the old Winnetka home server," I said, my voice dangerously calm, cutting right through the ambient, soothing spa music playing overhead. "I want to know exactly how long you spent downloading the Aegis respiratory schematics before you handed them over to your father." Brittany froze for a fraction of a second. Then, instead of denying it, she let out a loud, mocking laugh. She leaned back against her chaise lounge, picking up her mimosa and taking a slow, arrogant sip. She genuinely believed she was entirely untouchable. "Oh, please," Brittany sneered, waving her hand dismissively at me. "Do not act like you are some tech genius guarding state secrets." My laptop was acting up, so I used the old family desktop. I saw that dusty old shared cloud drive you used to dump your little hobby projects in. Dad was stressing out about the Illinois State Hospital bid. He said he desperately needed a new product design to secure the contract because his current inventory was too outdated to legally qualify. She smiled a vicious, triumphant smirk that showed all her perfectly veneered teeth. "So I took your little drawings." I dragged and dropped the files onto a flash drive and handed them to him. He had his graphic designer slap the Apex logo on the cover page and submitted it to the state board this morning. "We won the $20 million bid, Natalie. Dad is taking us to Paris next month to celebrate. You should be thanking me. Your little doodles finally made themselves useful to the family business." I stared at her, genuinely astounded by her sheer, unapologetic stupidity. She had absolutely no concept of intellectual property law. She had no idea she had just casually admitted to corporate espionage, digital theft, and defrauding a government entity. She thought she had just borrowed a sweater from my closet without asking. "Those were not doodles," I said, keeping my posture entirely rigid. "Those were proprietary engineering blueprints. You stole highly classified corporate property." Patricia slammed her mimosa glass down on the side table. The crystal rang sharply against the marble. "Stop being so horribly dramatic," Patricia snapped, adjusting the plush collar of her robe with an annoyed huff. "You have always had an inflated sense of self-importance. So what if she borrowed your little drawings? You owe this family. If it wasn't for Richard, your mother's patent would have died with her." The entire world seemed to stop spinning. The ambient spa music faded into a dull, rushing roar in my ears. The air in the room suddenly felt incredibly thin. I stared at Patricia, my mind rapidly rewinding through my entire childhood. My biological mother, a dedicated and brilliant respiratory therapist, had spent her evenings sketching medical devices at our cramped kitchen table before her illness ultimately consumed her. I had always assumed her life's work was lost to time, swallowed up by the chaos of her rapid decline and Richard's swift, cold remarriage to Patricia. But Patricia's vicious words just handed me the missing piece of the puzzle. My mother had not just sketched ideas. She had secured a patent, a revolutionary breathing valve patent. And Richard had not just built his medical distribution company from scratch. He had built his entire foundational fortune on the back of my dead mother's stolen intellectual property. He took her life's work, buried her memory, and used her genius to fund Patricia and Brittany's luxurious, entitled existence. "What did you just say?" I asked, my voice dropping to a barely audible whisper. Patricia crossed her arms, completely missing the dangerous, volatile shift in my demeanor. She thought she was putting me in my place. "You heard me," she hissed maliciously. "Your mother was a pathetic, weak woman who left you nothing. Richard took that dormant, useless patent she was obsessing over and turned it into actual money. He monetized it. He gave it value. You have no right to walk in here and play the victim when your entire existence has been subsidized by his business acumen. You should be on your knees thanking him for taking her useless paperwork and turning it into a real company." Brittany chimed in from the lounge chair, laughing lightly. "Exactly. So take your little online hustle and go back to your cheap apartment. The adults are doing real business now." The cold, dark satisfaction I had felt in my penthouse earlier returned, magnifying 1,000 times over. They had absolutely no idea the magnitude of the trap they had just walked into. They had no idea that Aegis Med Supply, the multi-million-dollar corporation currently dominating the medical tech industry, was my little online hustle. And they had absolutely no idea that the phone resting innocently in the front pocket of my blazer, the camera lens facing perfectly forward, had been recording every single second of this conversation. I had started the recording app the moment I walked into the country club, hoping to catch Brittany verbally admitting to the digital theft of the Aegis blueprints. Instead, I had caught something far more destructive. I had captured a full, uncoerced confession of corporate espionage and a direct, undeniable admission that Richard's entire empire was built on stolen intellectual property. I looked at Patricia, my face an impenetrable mask of absolute calm. I did not scream. I did not cry over my mother's stolen legacy. I simply let a slow, terrifying smile spread across my face. "You are absolutely right, Patricia," I said softly, taking a deliberate step back toward the glass doors. "Richard really did monetize her work, but he forgot to teach his daughter how corporate supply chains operate. Enjoy your victory trip to Paris, Brittany. I highly suggest you pack light." I turned and walked out of the spa, leaving them staring after me in total bewildered silence. I did not need to argue anymore. I had the recording, I had the blueprints, I had the state contract trap perfectly set. I pulled my phone from my pocket, stopped the recording, and immediately uploaded the encrypted audio file directly to my legal team. The corporate war was no longer just about winning a state contract. It was about taking back my mother's legacy, and I was going to burn Richard's stolen empire to the absolute ground. I sat across the sprawling glass desk of Elias Vance, one of the most ruthless corporate litigators in Chicago. The audio recording from the country club spa played through the high-fidelity speakers of his office. When Patricia's voice echoed through the room, loudly boasting about Richard stealing my mother's dormant patent and monetizing her life's work, Elias did not just smile. He leaned back in his leather chair and steepled his fingers, the universal gesture of a lawyer who had just been handed a winning lottery ticket. We listened as Brittany proudly confessed to digital theft and corporate espionage, openly admitting to stealing the proprietary medical blueprints from my old home network drive. When the recording ended with the soft click of the spa door closing, the silence in the office was absolute. Elias let out a low whistle, tapping his pen against the desk. "They basically gift-wrapped their own federal indictments," he said, pulling up my biological mother's original patent filings on his monitor. He turned the screen toward me. "Your mother was a genius," Elias explained. She finalized the blueprints for a revolutionary high-flow respiratory valve while she was actively undergoing treatment herself. She filed the preliminary paperwork under her maiden name to protect it, but Richard, acting as her legal proxy during her final days in hospice, quietly transferred the holding rights to a dummy corporation he controlled. He legally erased her. He buried her legacy to build his distribution empire, and now he is trying to use your company's stolen schematics to win a $20 million state contract to save that very same empire. I stared at the screen, my chest tightening as I looked at my mother's intricate hand-drawn diagrams. It was brilliant, and Richard had stolen it without a second thought. But there is still one massive problem, Elias cautioned, sobering quickly. We can destroy them for intellectual property theft and corporate espionage using this recording. But the $2 million in Medicare fraud filed under your Social Security number is a separate beast. The federal investigators have your identity locked. To clear your name completely and shift the federal crosshairs directly onto Richard, we cannot just prove he is a thief. We have to prove he orchestrated the fraudulent billing. We need to pierce the corporate veil. We need his actual internal financial ledgers, and a man like Richard will have those buried under a dozen shell companies. Before I could answer, my phone vibrated in my pocket. I pulled it out. It was a notification from an encrypted messaging app I strictly used for highly sensitive corporate communications. The message was from an unknown number. It contained a single address for an abandoned industrial parking garage on the south side of the city, followed by a brief instruction. Come alone at 9 tonight. I have what you need. I showed the screen to Elias. He frowned, warning me against walking into a potential trap, but I had already made up my mind. I was not backing down. 4 hours later, I pulled my sleek black SUV into the desolate, dimly lit parking structure. The air was cold and damp, smelling of old motor oil and concrete dust. Flickering fluorescent lights cast long, distorted shadows across the empty concrete pillars. In the far corner of the bottom level, a single car was parked with its headlights off. I parked a safe distance away, keeping my engine running as I stepped out into the damp air. The driver's side door of the parked car opened. A tall figure stepped out into the dim light. It was Jamal. He looked entirely different from the panicked, sweating man who had burst into Richard's office days ago. The polished, subservient facade he always wore around my family was completely gone. Here, in the shadows of the concrete structure, he was cold, precise, and sharply focused. He leaned against the hood of his car, lighting a cigarette. I had known him for 4 years and had never once seen him smoke. "I did not think you would actually show up," Jamal said quietly, the glowing cherry of the cigarette illuminating his exhausted face. "You sent an encrypted message to a woman fighting a federal fraud investigation," I replied, keeping my distance. "You have 5 minutes before I leave." Jamal took a slow drag of his cigarette and exhaled a thick cloud of smoke. He looked at me, his eyes dark and heavy, with an unbearable weight. He did not offer any superficial greetings or pretend we were friends. He went straight to the brutal truth. "I know about the Medicare fraud," Natalie, Jamal stated flatly. "I know Richard has been using your medical history to bill the federal government for commercial-grade respiratory equipment. And I know about the $20 million state contract bid he submitted this morning using your company's stolen designs." I maintained my composure, hiding my surprise. "If you know all of this, then why are you standing in a freezing garage with me instead of helping your father-in-law cover his tracks?" Jamal let out a bitter, humorless laugh. He dropped his cigarette onto the concrete and crushed it under the heel of his expensive shoe. "Do you think I don't know why Richard hired me? Do you really think I am blind to how this family operates?" He stepped away from the car, the raw anger finally breaking through his composed exterior. "They smile at me at dinners, but Richard made me the chief financial officer on paper only. They are setting me up to take the fall for the insurance fraud because they think the feds will easily pin it on the black guy." The blunt reality of his words hung in the freezing air. It made perfect, sickening sense. Richard and Patricia paraded Jamal around at their country club galas as the Ivy League-educated, diverse addition to their perfect family. But behind closed doors, they treated him like a highly paid servant. Richard had given Jamal the prestigious title of CFO, meaning Jamal's signature was on every single federal compliance document, every tax return, and every insurance billing form. But Richard tightly controlled the actual bank tokens and the digital routing numbers. Jamal possessed all of the legal liability and absolutely none of the actual power. I saw the numbers bleeding out months ago. Jamal continued, his voice tight with suppressed rage. I am a risk analyst, Natalie. I know how to track missing money. When the bank threatened to foreclose on our corporate loans, I dug into the encrypted servers Richard thought I could not access. I found the dual ledgers. I saw the millions he funneled into offshore accounts while leaving the company completely bankrupt. When the FBI finally kicks the doors in, Richard plans to point the finger at his rogue CFO and his estranged, mentally unstable daughter. He plans to walk away clean while we both go to federal prison. Jamal reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket. He pulled out a small metallic USB drive. He held it up in the dim light, the metal glinting sharply. You run Aegis Med Supply, Jamal said, a statement of fact rather than a question. You have the capital, the corporate power, and the legal team to utterly destroy him. I do not. I am trapped in a marriage to a woman who views me as a status symbol and a father-in-law who views me as a human shield. He walked forward and slid the USB drive across the cold hood of my SUV. It stopped inches from my hand. Here are Richard's real ledgers. Burn them to the ground. But I need immunity. We left the freezing concrete of the parking garage and drove in separate cars back to my downtown penthouse. Jamal stepped out of the private elevator, his eyes sweeping over the custom artwork and the panoramic views of the Chicago skyline. He did not say a single word about the luxury. He walked straight to the massive marble kitchen island, took off his coat, and set the metallic USB drive on the counter with a heavy sigh. I pulled out a secure standalone laptop, disconnected it from my main corporate network to prevent any tracebacks, and plugged the drive in. Jamal leaned over the keyboard and typed in a string of complex decryption passwords. The screen flickered, then flooded with hidden folders. These are the shadow ledgers, Jamal said, his voice completely devoid of emotion as he clicked open the master financial spreadsheet. Look closely at the operating capital. I leaned in, my eyes scanning the dense rows of numbers. My blood ran cold, not out of fear, but out of sheer, unadulterated shock. Apex Respiratory Solutions was not just struggling, it was a rotting corporate corpse. The numbers were entirely red. Richard had leveraged every single tangible asset the company owned. He had absolutely zero cash reserves. He was bouncing payroll checks for his warehouse staff while simultaneously siphoning corporate funds to pay for Patricia's country club memberships and Brittany's extravagant credit card bills. He is completely bankrupt, I stated, staring at the screen. Jamal nodded grimly. He has been insolvent for 6 months. He has been moving imaginary money from one shell company to another just to keep the lights on. But yesterday he panicked. When he stole your blueprints and won that $20 million state contract, he realized he actually had to manufacture the machines. He needed immediate massive liquid capital to buy raw materials and secure factory lines. Capital he absolutely did not have. I frowned, clicking through a subfolder labeled Private Financing. How did he secure manufacturing capital if his credit lines are maxed out? No legitimate bank would approve a corporate loan of that magnitude with these disastrous financials. Jamal pointed to a PDF document. Open that. He bypassed traditional corporate lenders entirely, Jamal explained. He went to a high-risk private equity firm. They agreed to front him a massive illegal bridge loan to cover the manufacturing costs of the stolen contract. But high-risk lenders require ironclad collateral. I opened the PDF file. It was a digitized copy of a binding loan agreement for $8 million. I scanned the collateral section. The first item listed was the sprawling Winnetka estate. Richard had quietly put a second mortgage on the house Patricia loved more than life itself, doing it entirely without her knowledge. But it was the second item on the collateral list that made my breath catch in my throat. Attached to the loan agreement was a personal financial guarantor form. Staring back at me from the bottom of the document printed in stark black ink was my own name, Natalie Vance, and right beneath it was my signature. It was an incredibly good forgery, mimicking the exact loops and slants of my handwriting, but it was definitively fake. I felt a sudden, violent surge of adrenaline. Richard had not just stolen my mother's patent and my company's blueprints. He had legally bound me to an $8 million illegal shadow loan. He forged my signature, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Jamal nodded, looking completely disgusted. He told the equity firm that you were a silent partner in Apex. He used your pristine credit rating and your status as a successful tech CEO to guarantee the loan. If he defaults on this money, the private equity firm gets Patricia's house, and then they come directly after your personal assets to collect the rest. Before I could fully process the sheer magnitude of Richard's criminal desperation, the silence in the penthouse was shattered by a harsh, vibrating buzz. Jamal's phone was ringing on the marble counter. The caller ID flashed Richard's name. Jamal looked at me, tension radiating through his shoulders. I gestured for him to answer and put it on speakerphone. Jamal tapped the screen. Richard's voice immediately barked through the speaker, loud, arrogant, and dripping with aggressive authority. Jamal, where the hell are you? I need those quarterly projections finalized by tomorrow morning. I am working on them from home. Richard? Jamal answered, his tone instantly shifting into the obedient, placating mask he always wore for my family. Richard scoffed loudly. We'll work faster. The annual Apex Investor Gala is this Saturday. We are hosting the top medical buyers in the Midwest at the Ritz-Carlton. I need those ledgers to look absolutely spotless. You need to cook the numbers, Jamal. Move the debt columns to the offshore holding accounts and inflate the projected revenue from the new state contract. The casual, unapologetic way Richard ordered him to commit federal fraud was staggering. But he was not finished. And listen to me, Richard, continued, his voice dropping into a condescending, deeply racist sneer. Do not mess this up like you messed up the tax filings last year. I gave you this job as a favor to Cassandra. I brought you into a respectable corporate world. Do not prove my country club friends right about you people lacking the proper pedigree for high finance. Be a good boy, Jamal. Clean up the numbers exactly like I told you to, or I will find someone who can. The line went dead with a sharp click. Jamal stood perfectly still, his jaw clenched so tightly a muscle feathered in his cheek. He stared at the darkened phone screen, the echo of Richard's blatant racist microaggressions still hanging heavily in the quiet air of my kitchen. He looked completely humiliated, but underneath the shame I saw a burning, desperate need for absolute retaliation. I reached out and gently closed the lid of the laptop. I looked at Jamal, my expression entirely calm, entirely ruthless. You have your immunity, Jamal, I said, my voice echoing with absolute authority. When the federal investigators raid Apex, my legal team will ensure you are officially classified as a cooperating whistleblower. You will not spend a single second in a courtroom. Jamal exhaled a long, shaky breath, the crushing weight of Richard's criminal setup finally lifting from his shoulders. What are you going to do? He asked, looking at me with a mixture of fear and profound respect. Are you going to call the police about the forged loan? Natalie smiles. Let them throw their gala. I am going to buy their debt from the bank tomorrow morning. By the time they pop the champagne, I will own them. My confrontation at the country club spa had rattled Patricia. Discreet calls to the family bank revealed someone used my credentials to request the formation documents for my biological mother's trust. Panic is a highly powerful motivator for a desperate woman living on stolen wealth. Patricia realized immediately that I was no longer a passive target. I was actively hunting them. She decided to strike first with a terrifying weapon. Patricia bypassed Richard entirely, knowing he was suffocating under his failing company. This required a woman's touch. She ordered her driver to the prestigious Gold Coast Medical District, stepping out in a flawless designer suit, clutching a leather portfolio. She bypassed Dr. Savannah's clinic reception, ignoring protests, and pushed directly into the private office. Dr. Savannah looked up, her expression instantly hardening. The doctor had stabilized me in the emergency room after my severe asthma attack days ago. She knew exactly the kind of environment I had barely survived. Patricia did not bother with pleasantries. She sat in the guest chair and placed her portfolio on the desk. She opened it and slid two items across the polished mahogany surface. The first was a cashier's check for $200,000. The second was a dense legal document bearing the seal of the Illinois State Court. Dr. Savannah glanced at the check, her face unreadable before picking up the legal document. It was a comprehensive psychiatric and medical evaluation form, fully filled out and requiring only an attending physician's signature. "I need you to sign this immediately," Patricia said, her voice dripping with forced sweetness. "It is a tragedy, really. Natalie has always been incredibly fragile, both physically and emotionally. We have all tried so hard to protect her from the stresses of the real world. But her recent medical episode has clearly taken a devastating toll on her cognitive functions." Dr. Savannah scanned the fabricated medical claims on the paperwork. Her eyes widened in absolute shock as she processed the sheer malice of the request. The document stated my severe asthma attack at the Winnetka estate resulted in critical brain hypoxia. It claimed the sudden oxygen deprivation had caused severe, irreversible neurological damage, rendering me completely mentally incompetent and entirely incapable of managing my own financial or personal affairs. Patricia was attempting to legally erase me, establishing the medical foundation for a total involuntary conservatorship. If this document was signed, Patricia and Richard would be granted absolute legal control over my life, my bank accounts, my company, and the stolen patent. I would become a legal ghost. "You want me to commit medical fraud?" Dr. Savannah stated, dropping the document back onto the desk as if it were coated in poison. "You want me to officially declare a perfectly healthy, highly intelligent young woman legally incompetent?" Patricia tapped her manicured nails against the armrest. "I am offering a generous donation to your clinic's research fund, doctor. Natalie is acting erratically. She is making wild accusations and threatening the stability of our family. She is a danger to herself. This conservatorship is for her own protection. It ensures she remains safely under our care." Dr. Savannah stood up, her professional demeanor giving way to raw, unadulterated disgust. She looked down at Patricia with absolute contempt. "You watched her almost die, Patricia," Dr. Savannah said, her voice shaking with restrained fury. "The paramedics told me exactly what happened when they arrived at your house. Natalie was suffocating on your dining room floor, and you did not even try to help her. You stood there and watched her lips turn blue. And now you have the absolute audacity to sit in my office and claim you want to protect her. I will not sign your fraudulent paperwork. I will not help you imprison your stepdaughter. Take your bribe and get out of my clinic before I call the medical board and report you." Patricia slowly stood up. The fake sweet smile vanished, completely replaced by a cold reptilian sneer. She leaned across the desk, invading the doctor's space. "She is a broken toy," Patricia snarled, her voice dropping to a vicious hiss. "She has always been defective. You are going to sign that document because you are a smart woman who understands how power works in this city. I sit on the board of directors for the two largest hospital networks in Chicago. My friends control the funding for your medical district. Sign the evaluation right now, or I will make sure your funding evaporates overnight. I will ruin your clinic, destroy your medical license, and ensure you never practice medicine in this state again." Patricia turned on her heel and walked out of the office, leaving the paperwork and the check sitting on the desk. She was supremely confident that the threat of complete professional ruin would force the doctor into compliance. Dr. Savannah waited until the heavy door clicked shut. She did not look at the check. She walked straight to her office door, locked the deadbolt, and immediately pulled her personal cell phone from her pocket. Her hands were shaking as she dialed my number. I was sitting in my penthouse office finalizing the massive corporate debt buyout with Jamal and my legal team when my phone rang. The caller ID showed Dr. Savannah's name. I answered immediately, expecting a follow-up regarding my respiratory medication. "Natalie, you need to listen to me very carefully right now," Dr. Savannah said, her voice breathless and frantic. "You need to secure your assets and call your lawyers right this second. Patricia was just in my office. They are coming for your freedom. She tried to bribe me into signing a completely falsified medical report, claiming you suffered severe brain damage from the asthma attack. I refused, but she has the paperwork ready, and she will simply find another doctor who is willing to take her money. You have 24 hours before they file the conservatorship with a corrupt judge. The crystal chandeliers of the Ritz-Carlton ballroom cast a blinding fractured light over Chicago's corporate elite. Richard had spared absolutely no expense for his succession gala. Towering ice sculptures flanked the caviar stations as waiters circulated with vintage champagne. The room buzzed with the arrogant hum of stolen victory. Tonight was supposed to be Richard's crowning achievement. He was celebrating the $20 million state hospital contract he had secured using my mother's stolen blueprints, and he was officially passing the corporate torch to Brittany. I stepped through the gilded double doors wearing a tailored charcoal suit that stood in stark contrast to the sea of sequins and silk. I did not have an invitation. I did not need one. The debt buyout had been finalized at 9 that morning. I was their largest primary creditor. I owned the very ground they were standing on. I had barely made it past the grand entryway when a hand clamped down on my wrist like a steel vice. I turned to find Patricia, her face a mask of perfectly contoured fury. She wore an emerald gown, but her eyes were cold and dead. She dragged me behind a massive floral arrangement shielding us from the view of the nearby investors. "You have 10 seconds to walk out those doors," Patricia hissed, nails digging into my sleeve. She pulled a folded legal document from her sequined clutch. I recognized the blue seal of the state court instantly. "Do not think you can play games with me, Natalie. Dr. Savannah might have grown a conscience, but money buys compliance in this city. I found a private physician more than willing to sign the psychiatric evaluation. These are the finalized conservatorship papers. The judge files them at 9 tomorrow morning. By noon, you will be locked in a psychiatric facility completely stripped of your legal rights and your company." Patricia smiled triumphantly. She thought the threat of institutionalization would break me. I looked down at her hand, then up at her face. I did not pull away. I stepped closer, closing the distance between us. "I suggest you put those forged papers away before I make a scene that will ruin your entire life," I said, my voice carrying a razor-sharp edge. Patricia scoffed, her grip tightening. "You are in no position to make demands, you delusional little brat. Security will drag you out of here in handcuffs." I smiled, letting the absolute certainty of my victory bleed into my expression. I raised my voice just enough so the wealthy investors nearby would hear. "Throw me out, Patricia. Call your security guards. Drag me out of this ballroom. But the absolute second I am outside those doors, I am picking up my phone and calling the state health inspectors. I will tell them what is sitting in your warehouses. I will give them the serial numbers for the counterfeit medical supplies you are serving to federal hospitals under the guise of high-flow respiratory equipment. I will tell them about the Medicare fraud." Patricia froze. The color drained from her face. The threat of a public scene was one thing, but the threat of an immediate federal health inspection was a corporate death sentence. She knew the warehouse was full of cheap, inadequate machines that could not pass a basic safety audit. If the inspectors arrived, the contract would evaporate instantly, followed rapidly by federal indictments. "You are bluffing," Patricia whispered, though her voice shook with sudden, undeniable terror. "Try me," I challenged, my gaze unwavering. "Call security. Let us see who loses everything tonight." Patricia stared at me, her mind frantically calculating the risks. She was a survivor, a parasite who knew exactly when to retreat to preserve the host. She released my wrist, sliding the papers back into her clutch. Her jaw clenched so tightly I thought her teeth might crack. "You are a monster!" She spat, her composure fracturing into raw hatred. "I learned from the absolute best," I replied smoothly, adjusting the cuff of my suit jacket. Patricia signaled a passing maitre d', her face twisting into a petty, malicious sneer. She could not throw me out, but she could still exercise her shallow brand of control. "Take this uninvited guest over to table 47, Patricia ordered the staff member. "Ensure she stays there." Table 47 was located in the absolute darkest corner of the ballroom. It was cramped tightly against the swinging doors of the catering kitchen, practically hidden behind a towering pillar. It was an insult, a deliberate banishment from the elite circle of investors and dignitaries seated near the stage. Patricia wanted me to feel small, isolated, and utterly powerless as I watched my family celebrate their stolen triumph. I accepted the escort without a single word of protest. I walked across the ballroom, feeling the vibrations of the heavy kitchen doors opening and closing behind my chair. The location of the table did not matter to me in the slightest. I sat down smoothing my jacket and looked across the expansive room. Richard was schmoozing near the front, shaking hands with hospital executives completely oblivious to the financial guillotine hanging directly over his neck. Brittany was preening near the stage, posing for photographs in a custom gown, eagerly awaiting her announcement as the new corporate successor. The room was packed with the most powerful investors in the state. They were all present, sipping wine and anticipating a night of profitable networking. I scanned the VIP tables arranged in a half circle around the podium. My eyes locked onto the center table. Jamal was seated there wearing an immaculate tuxedo surrounded by Richard's closest corporate allies. He looked up, his gaze cutting through the crowd to find me sitting in the shadows by the kitchen. He raised his crystal champagne flute to his lips and gave me a single slow wink. The trap was officially set and it was finally ready to be sprung. The hum of conversations died as the ballroom lights dimmed. A brilliant spotlight illuminated the main stage. Richard stepped up to the acrylic podium, his chest puffed out with pride. The applause was deafening. He raised his hands, basking in the adoration of state hospital executives and private equity investors. "Thank you all for joining us tonight," Richard began, his voice booming through the high-fidelity speakers. For decades, Apex Respiratory Solutions has been a pillar of the Chicago medical community. But to survive, a company must evolve. We must innovate. Tonight, we celebrate our new $20 million hospital contract. That future belongs to the brilliant mind who engineered our revolutionary new valve. Ladies and gentlemen, the new CEO, my daughter Brittany. The room erupted into thunderous applause. Brittany glided onto the stage wearing a shimmering silver gown. She embraced Richard, performing the perfect picture of corporate succession. She stepped up to the microphone, offering a practiced, modest smile. "Thank you, Dad," Brittany said, her voice dripping with artificial humility. When I conceptualized this valve, I wanted to solve a critical issue. Our new Apex manifold maximizes oxygen delivery while remaining lightweight. A massive digital screen behind her flickered to life. A high-resolution 3D rendering of the valve appeared, slowly rotating to display its internal components. My heart pounded heavily against my ribs. I stared at the screen. It was an exact line-for-line digital recreation of the hand-drawn blueprints my biological mother finalized in her hospice bed. As you can see, Brittany continued gesturing with a laser pointer. The sleek exterior design allows for maximum patient comfort, while the internal structure guarantees consistent flow rates. It is a game-changer for emergency rooms. She paused, waiting for the murmurs of impressed approval. She was treating a complex piece of life-saving medical equipment like a designer handbag, focusing entirely on the sleek exterior while understanding absolutely nothing about the internal mechanics. I pushed my chair back from table 47. The legs scraped loudly against the hardwood floor. I stood up. The darkness of the back corner had hidden me until now, but as I stepped forward, the light caught me. "If the flow rates are so flawlessly consistent," I said, my voice carrying clearly across the vast ballroom, "how exactly does your brilliant design compensate for the aerodynamic resistance in the secondary manifold during a sudden, unanticipated pressure spike?" The silence that followed was absolute. Hundreds of heads turned toward the back. Brittany froze, her laser pointer wavering off the screen and shaking violently against the backstage curtain. I took one slow, deliberate step forward down the center aisle. The wealthy investors watched me closely, their expressions shifting from mild annoyance to intense curiosity. "It is a very simple question for the chief engineer," I continued, my voice echoing. "The intake nozzles you displayed feature a uniquely tapered gauge. Under a high-pressure surge from the primary oxygen tank, that taper will cause a severe aerodynamic bottleneck. If you have not calculated the exact aerodynamic resistance threshold, The valve will rupture, flooding the patient's fragile lungs with pressurized air. So, Brittany, what is the exact PSI threshold? Brittany's face drained of all color. She gripped the edges of the acrylic podium, her knuckles turning white. She opened her mouth, but no sound came out. She looked at the giant schematic behind her, as if it were a foreign language. The confident CEO facade shattered instantly, exposing the terrified fraud underneath. She had absolutely no idea how to read it. The absolute silence stretched on, becoming agonizingly heavy in the massive space. Hospital executives at the front VIP tables exchanged uneasy, troubled glances, whispering to one another. A prominent health investor seated near the aisle frowned deeply, crossing his arms as he stared at the stage in absolute disbelief. "I do not," Brittany stammered, her voice thin and reedy. "The engineering team handles the specific pressure variables. I oversaw the broader conceptual framework. You are actively selling a $20 million medical device to the state of Illinois," I stated, taking another calm step forward. "And you do not even know its basic safety parameters." Richard realized the catastrophe unfolding in real time. He shoved Brittany aside, snatching the microphone from the stand, his face turning purple with rage. "Security!" Richard bellowed, pointing a shaking finger directly at me. "Get her out of here right now. She is a disgruntled former employee with severe mental instability. My daughter does not need to answer technical questions from a college dropout." Two large security guards in dark suits moved quickly down the side aisles, heading straight toward me. I did not flinch. I kept my eyes locked on Richard and continued walking deliberately toward the brightly lit stage. A sharp, authoritative voice stopped the guards cold. "Do not touch her," Jamal said. He stood up from his seat at the center VIP table. He turned to the security guards, his expression commanding. "She is a registered corporate guest here. Stand down." The guards hesitated, looking from the chief financial officer to Richard, unsure whose authority superseded the other. In their hesitation, I walked right past them, stopping just at the edge of the stage stairs. I looked up at Richard. He was gripping the microphone stand. "You are right, Richard," I said, my voice carrying clearly, slicing through the heavy tension of the room. "She does not need to answer to a college dropout like me." I reached into the inner pocket of my suit jacket. I pulled out a thick, folded sheaf of premium legal paper. I held it up high so the bright stage lights brilliantly illuminated the golden seal of the United States government pressed into the heavy paper. "But she does need to answer to the U.S. Patent Office," I said, staring directly into Richard's horrified eyes. "Because I hold the absolute copyright to that exact schematic on the screen behind you." The investors erupted. The polite, hushed murmurs of the wealthy elite instantly dissolved into a chaotic chorus of outrage and shock. Men in bespoke suits and women in couture gowns pointed at the stage, their voices overlapping as the reality of my statement crashed over them. I stood completely still, holding the heavy gold-sealed copyright document high in the air for every single hospital executive and private equity backer to see. The digital schematic glowing on the massive screen behind Brittany was no longer a symbol of their corporate future. It was a glaring $20 million beacon of federal theft. The air in the room grew thick with the sudden realization that their investments were tied to stolen intellectual property. Patricia watched her entire world disintegrating. The social empire she had ruthlessly constructed on stolen wealth was collapsing right in front of her eyes. Her perfectly contoured face twisted into a mask of absolute, unadulterated panic. She abandoned her seat at the VIP table, her emerald gown catching the light as she aggressively shoved her way toward the front of the stage, ignoring the indignant protests of the guests she pushed aside. She dug frantically into her sequined clutch and ripped out the folded legal document bearing the blue state court seal. She waved the forged psychiatric evaluation frantically in the air, her voice piercing the uproar of the ballroom. "Grab her right now!" Patricia screamed, pointing a trembling finger directly at my chest. "Do not listen to a single word she says. She is having a severe mental breakdown. We have the medical papers right here." The two large security guards who had previously hesitated now surged forward. The presence of official medical documents gave them the legal cover they needed to act. They moved swiftly down the center aisle, their hands reaching out to physically restrain me. Patricia smirked a fleeting look of wicked triumph, flashing across her pale face. My family thought they had won. They were weaponizing mental health to silence me, a brutal psychological tactic they had perfected since my childhood. Whenever I had spoken the truth about their financial theft or emotional neglect, they had simply labeled me unstable, isolating me, and convincing the world I was a fragile, hysterical girl. They were using their oldest, most reliable weapon to protect a multi-million-dollar fraud in front of Chicago's elite. Stop right there. The authoritative voice sliced through the chaos like a heavy blade. It did not come from me. It came from the dense crowd near the grand entrance. The security guards froze mid-step. The entire ballroom turned as one single, utterly shocked entity. Dr. Savannah stepped out from the sea of wealthy guests, dressed impeccably in a sharp, tailored navy suit. She did not look like a woman who could be intimidated or silenced. She radiated absolute fury. Dr. Savannah marched straight down the center aisle. The crowd of investors parted for her, instinctively sensing the immense energy in her stride. She walked right past the paralyzed security guards, ascended the short, carpeted staircase, and confidently snatched the microphone directly out of Brittany's trembling hand. "Give me those papers," Dr. Savannah commanded, staring down at Patricia. Patricia stood frozen in terror, clutching the forged documents against her chest. She looked like a cornered animal, her eyes darting frantically around the room for an escape route. Dr. Savannah did not wait for permission. She stepped forward, reached down, and firmly pulled the blue sealed documents from Patricia's rigid grip. Dr. Savannah publicly examined the papers under the bright stage lights. She flipped through the pages, her eyes scanning the fabricated medical claims and the illegitimate signatures. The ballroom was so quiet you could hear the heavy, rapid breathing of the executives in the front row. The tension was thick enough to choke on. Dr. Savannah lowered the papers, raising the microphone to her lips. "As a board-certified physician, I can confirm these documents are forged," Dr. Savannah stated, her voice ringing with absolute clarity and unwavering authority. "In fact, Patricia offered me $50,000 to sign them yesterday." A collective gasp ripped through the ballroom. The sound was deafening, a visceral reaction of pure disgust from hundreds of people simultaneously. The investors recoiled, pulling back from the stage as if Patricia had suddenly become radioactive. The sheer malice of the crime was incomprehensible. A mother attempting to legally erase her own stepdaughter through medical fraud and bribery was a scandal that went far beyond corporate theft. Patricia turned a ghastly, translucent pale. All the blood drained from her face, leaving her looking hollow and ruined. Her legs gave out and she stumbled backward, collapsing heavily into an empty chair at the front table. She covered her face with her shaking hands, entirely defeated, utterly destroyed in front of the very society she had fought so ruthlessly to dominate. Richard realized the catastrophe was terminal. He watched his wife collapse and his daughter cower behind the podium. He saw the $20 million hospital contract evaporating, followed rapidly by the undeniable threat of federal indictments. He needed a distraction, a massive redirection to stop the investors from walking out the doors and calling the authorities. He leaped forward, grabbing a secondary microphone from the podium stand, his face slick with nervous sweat. He forced a manic, terrifyingly fake corporate smile. "This is just family drama," Richard yelled into the microphone, his voice cracking with desperation. "Please, everyone remain calm. Do not let personal disputes cloud your financial judgment. Investors, do not worry about this minor distraction. I have incredible news. We have just secured a massive buyout from a multinational conglomerate, Aegis Med Supply. They are acquiring our entire operation for an unprecedented sum. We are financially bulletproof." He threw his arms out wide, desperately trying to project victory and stability. He thought the promise of a massive corporate acquisition would blind the investors to the fraud and the forged medical documents. He believed greed would conquer morality. I stood at the edge of the stage, watching Richard dig his own grave with profound satisfaction. I slowly turned my head and looked toward the back of the ballroom. I made direct eye contact with the lead sound technician standing in the elevated control booth. I gave him a single sharp nod. The massive digital screen behind Richard flickered violently. The high-resolution 3D rendering of the stolen breathing valve vanished. The Apex Respiratory Solutions logo disappeared into a sea of static. Instead of Richard's triumphant branding, the screen illuminated the entire ballroom with a stark, blinding white background. A massive live bank transfer window appeared in crisp black text alongside the Aegis Med Supply corporate crest. Richard spun around to face the massive digital display. Instead of a malfunction, he saw the authoritative crest of Aegis Med Supply glowing brightly above a live banking window. The sheer relief that washed over his sweating face was almost pathetic. He actually believed his own desperate lie had somehow miraculously materialized into reality. He turned back to the crowd, throwing his arms wide open in a grand sweeping gesture of unearned victory. "See," Richard shouted into the microphone, his voice echoing off the marble pillars and crystal chandeliers. "I told you we were financially bulletproof. Aegis Med Supply is buying us out for $30 million. This transfer window is the absolute proof of our corporate salvation. The future of Apex is secured under a global umbrella. You are looking at the dawn of a highly profitable new era for every single investor in this room." He looked down at the VIP tables, desperately searching for validation from the state hospital executives and private equity backers. A few investors murmured, confused by the sudden jarring shift from medical fraud and forged psychiatric papers to a massive corporate merger. Patricia remained slumped in her chair, her face buried in her trembling hands, too broken by Dr. Savannah's public execution to even comprehend Richard's frantic, delusional pivot. Brittany stood completely frozen near the edge of the stage, her silver gown shimmering as she stared blankly at the screen. I walked up the carpeted stairs of the stage. The heavy, oppressive silence of the room returned, broken only by the rhythmic, deliberate click of my heels. I did not rush. I let every single person in that sprawling ballroom watch me invade Richard's sacred space. He noticed me approaching, and his arrogant smile faltered instantly, replaced by a deep primal panic. He tried to step sideways to block my path, puffing out his chest to physically intimidate me, but I did not stop. I walked directly into his personal space, forcing him to take a clumsy, stumbling step backward to avoid a collision. I reached out and calmly took the microphone directly from his sweating hand. He was too stunned to resist. He simply let it go, staring at me with wide, terrified eyes. I turned to face the hundreds of wealthy guests. The gray-haired lead investor who had snapped his crystal champagne glass earlier leaned forward in his plush seat, his eyes locked onto me with intense, burning anticipation. Jamal sat perfectly still at the table, a faint, knowing smile playing on his lips as he watched the final act of my master plan unfold. "Correction, Richard," I said, my voice projecting crisp and clear across the vast ballroom. "Aegis Med Supply is not buying you out to save you. Aegis is not infusing $30 million into a failing company built entirely on stolen patents and counterfeit medical supplies." I gestured elegantly to the massive digital screen behind us, where the live banking window displayed a rapid sequence of aggressive financial transfers. "Aegis bought your defaulted corporate loans from the family bank for pennies on the dollar." I continued, keeping my tone ruthlessly even. "Every single line of credit you extended, every massive mortgage you leveraged against your manufacturing warehouses, every personal guarantee you recklessly signed to keep Apex afloat while you bled its accounts completely dry to fund Patricia's lavish country club lifestyle. Aegis owns absolutely all of it. The bank transfer you see on that screen right now is not an acquisition payment. It is the immediate hostile execution of those exact debts. We are calling in the loans, Richard. All of them. Tonight. You are entirely bankrupt." The ballroom erupted into a wild frenzy of shocked whispers. The executives at the VIP tables began furiously typing on their cell phones, likely contacting their own legal teams to pull their investments before the federal indictments dropped tomorrow morning. Richard's face contorted into a terrifying mask of absolute unhinged denial. He lunged forward desperately, trying to snatch the microphone back from me, but I smoothly stepped aside. "You are lying." Richard spat, his voice cracking loudly without the amplification of the speakers. You are a delusional, bitter little girl, making up ridiculous financial fairy tales. Aegis is a multinational titan. They operate heavily on 3 continents. They are acquiring my company to expand their respiratory division globally. You know absolutely nothing about Aegis Med Supply. You have never even set foot inside a real corporate boardroom. You are nothing but a dropout trying to ruin my legacy. He turned his frantic, wide-eyed gaze toward the gray-haired investor at the front table. Do not listen to her. Richard pleaded, drops of sweat dripping from his chin onto his expensive tuxedo shirt. She is orchestrating a sick stunt to ruin my pristine reputation. My top lawyers have been negotiating this specific buyout with Aegis executives for weeks. I have the private emails. I have the term sheets. We are finalizing the merger as we speak. I reached into the inner breast pocket of my tailored charcoal suit. I did not break eye contact with Richard as I withdrew a sleek matte black business card. The card was heavy, forged from solid metal and deeply embossed with silver lettering. I walked to the edge of the stage, crouching down to hand the heavy card to the gray-haired lead investor. He took it cautiously, turning it over under the bright ballroom lights. The room fell into a dead, suffocating silence. Everyone waited, holding their collective breath, watching the senior investor's eyes scan the silver text. Read it aloud, I instructed quietly, yet my voice carried to the back of the room. The investor cleared his throat, his authoritative voice ringing through the quiet room without the need for a microphone. Natalie, the investor, read, his eyes widening in absolute shock as he looked up at me. Founder and Chief Executive Officer, Aegis Med Supply. The sound of Richard's knees buckling echoed loudly and sharply. Richard hit the carpeted floor with a sickening thud. The sound of his knees buckling echoed through the microphone I held. He did not pass out, but his legs refused to support the crushing weight of his reality. He simply knelt there, staring blankly at the polished black shoes of the lead investor, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. The executive stepped back, dropping my business card onto the stage as if it were burning coal. The ballroom exploded. The momentary stunned silence shattered into a chaotic uproar of shouting executives, panicked board members, and frantically dialing cell phones. The elite facade of the community dissolved into a desperate scramble for self-preservation. Investors who had been clinking champagne glasses with Richard 10 minutes ago were now actively sprinting toward the exit doors, fleeing the imploding company. "It is a lie!" Patricia shrieked, her voice tearing through the deafening noise. She scrambled up from her chair, her emerald gown catching on the edge of the table. She pointed a finger at me, her face flushed with desperation. She is a pathological liar. She fabricated that card. Aegis Med Supply is a massive global conglomerate, not a toy for a defective brat. Arrest her for corporate sabotage. I did not shout over her. I simply tapped the microphone twice, the sharp percussive thumps cutting through the ballroom's acoustics. I looked up at the glass-enclosed sound booth at the back of the room. Display the assignment files, I commanded smoothly. The massive digital screen behind me shifted instantly. The live banking window vanished, replaced immediately by a series of high-resolution, undeniably authentic legal documents. They were not internal memos or corporate proposals. They were finalized, stamped, and federally recorded financing statements. Dozens of them flashed across the screen in rapid succession. Every document bore the signature of Richard, pledging his company, his manufacturing equipment, his proprietary technology, and his personal assets as collateral for the massive, reckless loans he had taken out from the family bank. And at the bottom of every single page was the official assignment of that debt. The creditor was no longer the bank. The absolute legal owner of every penny Richard owed was Aegis Med Supply. I am not a saboteur, Patricia, I said, my voice projecting crisp and lethal across the panicked crowd. I am your sole creditor. I own every single outstanding loan, mortgage, and line of credit associated with Apex Respiratory Solutions and the entire Blackwell family. I purchased your debt for pennies on the dollar because your private bank knew your company was secretly hemorrhaging cash to fund your lavish country club lifestyle. Richard scrambled to his feet, gripping the acrylic podium for support. His face was a mask of sheer terror. "You cannot do this," he gasped, his chest heaving. "We are current on our payments. We just secured the $20 million state hospital contract. You cannot legally call in the loans if the company is solvent. I will tie you up in litigation for the next decade." I turned to face him, offering a cold, merciless smile. "You would be absolutely right, Richard." Under normal circumstances, I agreed, stepping closer to him. However, standard commercial loan agreements contain very specific breach of contract clauses. A borrower defaults immediately without the option to cure if they engage in criminal fraud to secure their revenue. I gestured to the screen where the image shifted back to the digital rendering of the breathing valve placed side by side with a scanned copy of my biological mother's hand-drawn blueprints complete with the federal copyright registration clearly displaying my name. "You used stolen, federally copyrighted intellectual property to secure a government hospital contract," I stated, ensuring every remaining investor heard the exact mechanics of his crimes. "That constitutes massive federal fraud. Your contract with the state of Illinois is null and void. Therefore, you are in immediate catastrophic default on every single loan I just purchased. I am officially foreclosing on your company. I am seizing your liquid assets. And I am taking immediate possession of the Winnetka estate which you so foolishly leveraged as secondary collateral." Brittany let out a piercing, hysterical scream. The polished professional CEO facade she had worn moments ago evaporated entirely, leaving behind the spoiled, entitled child she truly was. "You cannot take our house!" Brittany shrieked, stomping her silver heel against the stage floor. "We have the trust fund. Mom promised me the money from your biological mother's trust. We finalized the paperwork this week. We have millions in private reserves. You cannot touch us." Her outburst was the final nail in their coffin. By screaming about the trust fund, she had publicly admitted their scheme to steal my maternal inheritance, confirming the depths of their financial depravity to a room full of powerful witnesses. She realized her mistake a second too late, her hands flying to cover her mouth. She spun around wildly, her eyes scanning the front tables until they locked onto the chief financial officer. "Jamal, do something!" Brittany wailed, her voice cracking with raw panic. "You manage the accounts, stop the transfers, call our lawyers right now, and stop her." The ballroom fell into a tense, expectant hush. Every eye shifted from the hysterical girl on the stage to the impeccably dressed executive seated at the center VIP table. Jamal sat perfectly still for a moment, his expression unreadable. He slowly placed his linen napkin on the table. He stood up with deliberate, measured grace. He reached down and casually buttoned his tailored tuxedo jacket. The wealthy investors parted to let him pass as he walked purposefully toward the stage. He ascended the stairs, but he did not walk toward Richard or Brittany. He walked directly across the platform and stopped firmly at my side, turning to face the ruined family. "I did call the lawyers," Jamal said, his voice calm, resonant, and echoing with absolute finality. "But not yours." Jamal turned to face Richard and Patricia, his posture radiating a quiet, dangerous composure. The wealthy investors remained absolutely silent, captivated by the sudden shift in power. Richard stared at his chief financial officer, his mouth opening and closing soundlessly. Patricia clutched the edge of the VIP table, her knuckles stark white, her eyes darting between Jamal and the exit doors. "You thought you could use me," Jamal said, his voice echoing off the walls with chilling clarity. "You thought a black man from the South Side would be the perfect scapegoat for your tax evasion and insurance fraud. You brought me into this family, gave me a fancy title, and put me in charge of the books because you assumed I would just be grateful. You assumed I would blindly sign the ledgers and take the fall." Richard took a shaky step forward, raising a trembling hand toward the stage. "Jamal, what are you doing? We gave you everything. We brought you into our home. You are married to my daughter." Jamal did not flinch. He reached into the inner pocket of his tailored suit jacket and slowly pulled out a small silver USB drive. He held it up high, letting the bright stage lights catch its metallic surface. The tiny device held the power to destroy the Blackwell Empire permanently. I have spent the last 6 months backing up every illegal transaction, Jamal stated, his gaze locking onto Patricia's face. Every hidden offshore account, every fabricated expense report, and worst of all, every fake Medicare claim you filed under Natalie's SSN. You thought you could bankrupt her, ruin her credit, and leave her responsible for your federal theft. You built a paper trail leading directly to her. Patricia let out a terrifying shriek. She lunged forward, knocking over a crystal centerpiece, her manicured facade shattered. You ungrateful traitor! We made you. You were nothing before you met Brittany. I will have you destroyed. I will hire the best legal team in the country and ensure you rot in a federal penitentiary. You cannot hire anyone, Patricia, I interjected, stepping up beside Jamal and looking down at the ruined woman. Your accounts are frozen. I initiated the total asset seizure 10 minutes ago. You do not have a single dime to your name. Jamal lowered the USB drive. I handed it all over to the FBI this morning. In exchange for full immunity, he said, delivering the final blow. Every ledger, every encrypted email, every forged signature you tried hiding. The federal prosecutors have been reviewing the files since dawn. They know how you structured the illegal shell companies. They know about the bribes you paid to the medical board. They know absolutely everything. Richard collapsed backward, hitting the stage floor hard. He scrambled frantically backward like a cornered rat. He looked at the gathered investors, pleading silently for intervention, but the executives simply turned their heads away in profound disgust. The men and women who had eagerly applauded him 30 minutes earlier now treated him like a toxic contagion. Brittany, who had been standing paralyzed near the podium, suddenly snapped into violent motion. The crushing reality of her vanishing lifestyle, her frozen bank accounts, and her impending public humiliation finally broke through her wall of denial. She let out a pathetic wail and threw herself forward across the wooden platform. She dropped heavily to her knees on the hard stage, the expensive fabric of her silver gown tearing against the sharp edge of a microphone stand. She scrambled across the polished floor, her heavy makeup running down her face in dark, messy streaks. She reached out desperately and grabbed Jamal's pant leg, her manicured fingers digging fiercely into the tailored fabric. "Jamal, please, Brittany," sobbed her voice, a high-pitched whine that echoed through the silent ballroom. "You cannot do this to me. I am your wife. I love you. We were supposed to build a life together. You promised to protect me. Please take it back. Tell them you lied. Tell them. Natalie put you up to this stunt. I will do anything you want. Just fix this." Jamal looked down at the weeping woman clinging desperately to his leg. His face remained an impenetrable mask of cold indifference. He did not reach down to comfort her trembling shoulders. He simply stared at her, absorbing the absolute reality of the woman who had happily spent stolen money while turning a blind eye to her family's monstrous crimes. Slowly, deliberately, Jamal raised his left hand into the air. He grasped the heavy platinum wedding band resting on his ring finger. He twisted the metal once, pulling it smoothly and firmly over his knuckle. He held the gleaming ring between his thumb and index finger for a fraction of a second, letting Brittany see the absolute finality of his deliberate final action. Then he simply dropped it. The heavy platinum band hit the wooden stage floor with a sharp, resonant clink. It rolled for a few inches before coming to a complete stop, right next to Brittany's trembling, tear-soaked hands. "We are officially done," Jamal said. His voice was completely devoid of emotion or hesitation. He gently but firmly pried her clutching fingers off his pant leg, stepping back to stand shoulder to shoulder with me in a united front. Brittany let out another agonizing scream, burying her face in her hands, completely shattered by the public rejection. At that exact moment, the heavy atmosphere in the ballroom shifted. A frantic murmur rippled through the back of the crowd near the grand entrance doors. The large windows lining the eastern wall of the ballroom suddenly illuminated with a harsh glare. Bright, rhythmic flashes of red and blue lights cut through the darkness outside, painting the terrified faces of Richard and Patricia in alternating colors. The flashing beams danced across the marble pillars and crystal chandeliers, signaling the absolute end of their reign. The federal authorities had finally arrived. The heavy oak doors of the grand entrance burst open with a deafening crash. More than a dozen federal agents wearing dark tactical gear bearing the bright yellow letters FBI flooded into the ballroom. They moved with absolute synchronized precision, spreading out to secure every single exit. The sheer force of their arrival shattered whatever fragile composure remained among the wealthy guests. The elite private equity backers and hospital executives, men and women who had just been eagerly preparing to profit from stolen intellectual property, instantly transformed into a terrified, stampeding herd. They scrambled over each other, knocking down velvet-draped chairs and shattering crystal champagne flutes in their desperate rush to distance themselves from my family. Nobody wanted to be caught standing near the epicenter of a massive federal fraud raid. The room devolved into pure, unadulterated chaos. Richard did not freeze. He operated on the instinct of a lifelong coward. He took one look at the federal agents advancing down the center aisle, spun around, and vaulted off the back of the stage. He landed heavily, twisting his ankle, but the adrenaline fueled his frantic scramble. He shoved a catering cart out of his way, sending silver trays crashing to the floor, and sprinted toward the discreet service doors near the kitchen. He actually believed he could outrun the consequences of his decades of theft. He did not even make it 10 feet. 2 federal agents flanked the corridor, stepping out from the shadows of the service hall. Richard tried to pivot, slipping on a spilled puddle of champagne. The agents tackled him instantly. The impact drove the breath from his lungs with a loud, pathetic wheeze. They slammed him face first into the polished marble floor, pinning his arms behind his back. The esteemed CEO of Apex Respiratory Solutions was reduced to a squirming, whimpering mess. His expensive bespoke suit ruined as cold steel cuffs clamped tightly around his wrists. Patricia watched her husband get pinned to the floor, and in that exact moment, the carefully curated illusion of their perfect high society marriage completely evaporated. She did not rush to his side to defend him. She did not express shock or sorrow. Instead, a vicious, feral rage consumed her. She marched over to where Richard was being hauled to his knees by the agents. Patricia raised her hand and viciously slapped him across the face. The sharp crack echoed over the noise of the retreating crowd. She hit him again, her perfectly manicured nails, leaving bright red scratches across his cheeks. "This is your fault," Patricia screamed, her voice shrill and entirely unhinged. "You said we would not get caught. You swore the shell companies were untraceable. You promised me this hospital contract would cover the missing millions. You ruined everything. You dragged me down with your incompetent, pathetic business schemes. I am not going to prison for your mistakes." Richard glared back at her, his own mask of loving devotion entirely stripped away. "My mistakes?" Richard spat, struggling against the agents holding him. "You are the one who spent $10 million on country club renovations and private jets while the company was bleeding cash. You forged the psychiatric papers. You bribed the doctors. You are just as guilty as I am, Patricia. Do not pretend you did not love spending every single stolen dime." Their vicious finger-pointing laid bare the absolute rot at the core of their relationship. They were not partners in life. They were simply co-conspirators in greed, instantly turning on each other the second the consequences arrived. 2 female agents stepped forward, grabbing Patricia by the arms and pulling them sharply behind her back. The loud click of the handcuffs sent a fresh wave of panic through her. "Take your hands off me!" Patricia demanded, thrashing against their grip. "Do you know who I am? I am the chairwoman of the Gold Coast Charity Board. I host fundraisers for the governor. You cannot treat me like a common criminal. I demand to speak to your superior. I demand to speak to the mayor. I have powerful friends who will have your badges for this outrage." The agents ignored her frantic name, dropping entirely, marching her forcefully toward the exit alongside her disgraced husband. Brittany remained curled in a ball on the stage floor, weeping hysterically as agents read her rights. The empire they had built on my mother's stolen blueprints and my stolen inheritance was completely dismantled in a matter of minutes. The local police arrived to assist the federal agents in clearing the ballroom, pushing the remaining lingering executives out into the cold Chicago night. The grand gala had transformed into a massive crime scene. I stood silently near the center of the stage, watching the flashing red and blue lights reflect off the shattered crystal and overturned tables. Jamal remained steadfast at my side, his posture relaxed, having finally unburdened himself of the toxic family he had married into. Dr. Savannah gave me a firm, respectful nod before picking up her leather briefcase and calmly walking out the front doors, her integrity entirely intact. The chaotic noise slowly subsided as the room was cleared. A tall, broad-shouldered federal agent wearing a dark suit and a badge clipped to his belt broke away from the team securing the perimeter. He walked down the center aisle, stepping carefully over the debris, and approached the edge of the stage. He looked directly up at me, his expression serious and entirely professional. He pulled a small notebook from his pocket, flipping it open. "Are you the CEO of Aegis?" he asked, his voice steady. I looked at the agent, feeling the absolute weight of the victory settling into my bones. I gave him a single, confident nod. "Yes, I am." The agent closed his notebook and tucked it away. He looked around the ruined ballroom, then back up at me. "The premises are yours, ma'am. They have exactly 5 minutes to vacate." The 5-minute warning triggered the final collapse of the Blackwell dynasty. Stragglers scrambled for the heavy brass exit doors, pressing against the silk wallpaper to clear a wide path down the center aisle. No one wanted to obstruct a federal raid. The agents hauled Richard up from the marble floor. His bespoke tuxedo was completely ruined, heavily smeared with dust and spilled champagne. He limped heavily, his wrists bound securely behind his back. The man who had spent a decade projecting an aura of untouchable wealth now looked like a thoroughly defeated criminal, keeping his head bowed, refusing to make eye contact with the high society elites he had spent years desperately trying to impress. Patricia refused to go quietly. 2 female agents gripped her upper arms, forcing her forward. She thrashed fiercely against their unyielding hold, her emerald gown catching the harsh glare of tactical flashlights. Her hair unraveled across her tear-streaked face. She locked eyes with wealthy socialites standing near the coat check. "Eleanor, do something," Patricia shrieked in absolute terror. "Call the governor right now. Tell them this is a massive misunderstanding. We are the Blackwells." Eleanor visibly recoiled, turning her back to quickly inspect her handbag. The rest of the country club circle followed suit, instantly excommunicating Patricia. The absolute rejection caused Patricia to let out a guttural scream. She dug her heels into the carpet, forcing the agents to drag her the final 20 yards out the front doors. The heavy glass portals swung shut, cutting off her demands for special treatment. The massive ballroom emptied with astonishing speed. Police officers directed the remaining stragglers out the side exits, securing the perimeter. The chaotic noise faded into a tense, expectant quiet. I remained standing near the podium on the main stage. Jamal had walked down the side stairs, offering me a final nod of respect before stepping out into the night to start his new life. Only Brittany remained on the platform. She knelt exactly where she had collapsed. A microphone stand had ripped a large tear down the side of her silver dress. Her evening makeup was completely ruined, leaving dark streaks running down her cheeks. She looked around the cavernous room, her chest heaving as the reality of her situation took hold. Her parents were headed to a federal holding facility. Her husband had publicly abandoned her. Her bank accounts were frozen. The Winnetka estate belonged to me. Absolutely everything was gone. She pushed herself up, her legs trembling visibly. She wiped her nose with the back of her hand, smearing makeup across her pale face. She turned slowly and looked at me. The arrogant bully I had known for 2 decades vanished entirely. In her place stood a terrified woman, realizing she possessed no skills to survive on her own. Brittany took a tentative step toward me, her posture incredibly submissive. She clasped her hands together in front of her chest, initiating a dramatic pivot. The vicious adversary instantly tried playing the helpless victim. Sister Brittany whimpered, her voice cracking as she forced tears to well up. "Please, Natalie, you have to help me. I had nothing to do with the fraud. I did not know what Richard and Mom were doing with the money. You cannot just leave me here. I have nowhere to go. I do not have a single dollar to my name. I did not flinch. I did not offer her a comforting hand. I stood perfectly still, channeling the exact cold, dismissive energy her mother had weaponized against me on my very first day in their house. I let the silence stretch out, forcing Brittany to stand in her humiliation. "Quit faking it, Brittany," I said, my voice projecting crisp and lethal across the empty stage. She gasped, stepping back. "But I am your sister," she pleaded, her voice rising in panic. "We grew up together." "We shared a roof," I corrected her coldly. "We were never sisters. You spent your entire life watching your parents treat me like a servant, and you eagerly joined in the abuse. You gladly spent the money they stole from my biological mother. You laughed when Patricia locked me out of dinners. You happily watched me scrub your floors while you lived a life of unearned luxury." "Please," Brittany begged, sinking back to her knees. "Enough drama," I commanded, cutting off her pathetic display instantly. "The performance is over. Your parents are going to federal prison, and you are finally going to learn what it means to actually work for a living. You have 2 hands. Get a job in a kitchen." I watched the color drain from her face as I fed Patricia's old, cruel words right back to her. The finality in my tone shattered her last hope for a bailout. She slumped forward, staring blankly at the scuffed floorboards, realizing the free ride was permanently over. I turned my back on her. I looked toward the side entrance where 2 men in dark suits stood waiting quietly in the shadows. They were the private security contractors I had hired through Aegis Med Supply. I caught the lead guard's eye and gave him a definitive gesture. "Escort her off my property," I instructed smoothly. The guards moved instantly, walking up the stage stairs with purposeful strides. They flanked Brittany, gripping her by the arms and hauling her to her feet. She did not fight them. All the fight had been drained out of her. They marched her toward the exit, her silver heels dragging across the floor. I stood alone in the center of the massive ballroom. Federal agents were quietly cataloging evidence in the sound booth above. The heavy oak doors clicked shut behind Brittany and the guards. The stage was completely empty. The silence that settled over the room was deafening, but for the very first time in my life, it was deeply, profoundly peaceful. The morning sun crested the Chicago skyline, pouring light into Aegis Med Supply headquarters. I stood in my 50th floor suite sipping coffee. The absolute tranquility offered a profound contrast to the destruction I orchestrated the night before. Richard and Patricia were waking up in federal holding cells. The Blackwell Empire was dismantled. I felt a deep, resonant peace. My sleek desk chimed. I tapped the flashing intercom button. My lead receptionist spoke with a professional tone. "Ms. Wilson, I apologize for the interruption, but there is a woman in the lobby demanding to see you. She claims to be your sister. She is refusing to leave and is begging security for an employment application or a cash advance." I set my coffee mug down. A cold resolve hardened in my chest. "Tell the security team to stand by," I instructed smoothly. "I am coming down right now." I stepped into the elevator and descended to the grand lobby. The Aegis reception area was a masterpiece of modern corporate architecture featuring soaring marble walls, brushed steel accents, and a digital waterfall. Standing in the center of this pristine environment was Brittany. She looked completely unrecognizable from the socialite who wore a silver gown just hours prior. She wore a stained tracksuit, her face pale and devoid of makeup. She was frantically waving a crumpled piece of paper at the security guards. I stepped out of the elevator, my heels clicking against the marble floor. The guards stepped back, parting seamlessly. Brittany spun around, her eyes wide with a panic. She rushed forward, stopping just short of my personal space, her hands clasping together in a pathetic display of submission. "Natalie, please." Brittany gasped, her voice shrill and echoing off the walls. "You have to help me. The federal agents seized my bank accounts. They locked me out of my condo because it was registered under the company holding group. I spent the night sitting in a police station waiting room because I had nowhere else to go. I need money. I need a job. I will do anything. I will work in the mailroom. I will scrub the floors in the cafeteria. Just give me an advance so I can get a hotel room." I looked down at her, my expression radiating the freezing coldness Patricia had subjected me to during childhood. The sheer audacity of her request was staggering. She had spent 2 decades actively participating in my psychological torment and eagerly spending the inheritance stolen from my biological mother. Now stripped of her stolen wealth, she expected me to open my checkbook. "Quit faking it, Brittany," I said, my voice projecting crisp and lethal across the massive lobby. "You scrubbed floors? You do not even know how to properly hold a mop. Aegis Med Supply hires highly qualified ethical professionals. We do not employ accessories to federal crimes." Brittany's face flushed a deep, ugly red. The submissive facade completely vanished instantly, replaced by the demanding brat she truly was. "You cannot do this to me," she shrieked, her voice cracking as she stomped her foot against the marble floor. "We share blood. You owe me. I am your family, and you are leaving me to die on the street." I did not raise my voice. I calmly reached into the pocket of my tailored blazer and pulled out a small rectangular plastic box. I held it up between us. Brittany stopped yelling, her eyes locking onto the object in utter confusion. "Do you remember this?" I asked quietly. She stared at the box, her brow furrowing. "No. Why would I know what that is?" I popped the lid open, revealing a small blue plastic asthma inhaler. It was old, scratched, and completely empty. "This was my emergency inhaler when I was 10 years old," I stated, ensuring every word landed with maximum impact. "I was having a severe asthma attack in the hallway of our house. I was gasping for air, clutching my chest." Patricia walked past me, picked up this exact inhaler, and threw it directly into the kitchen trash can. She told me to stop faking a medical emergency for attention. "And you stood right next to her, Brittany. You watched me suffocating on the floor and you laughed." Brittany shrank back, her mouth opening and closing wordlessly as the brutal reality of her past actions confronted her. "I dug this out of the trash," I continued, snapping the box shut. "I kept it as a permanent reminder of exactly who you people are. Blood does not make family, Brittany. Character does. You and your parents lack both. You do not get to invoke family loyalty only when your bank account runs dry." "But I have absolutely nothing," she sobbed, burying her face in her hands. "How am I supposed to survive? Patricia gave me a $20 bill when she abandoned me outside a locked house during a blizzard, expecting me to simply figure it out," I said. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a single crisp $20 bill. I dropped the money onto the pristine marble floor right at her feet. "This will cover your Uber ride to a homeless shelter. Figure it out." Brittany stared down at the green bill resting on the polished stone, paralyzed by the absolute finality of my rejection. She looked back up at me, her face a mask of total devastation. "Never come to my building again," I commanded softly. I turned my back on her without waiting for a response. I gave a sharp, definitive nod to the 2 towering security guards. They stepped forward immediately, gripping Brittany by her arms and marching her forcefully toward the rotating glass exit doors. I did not look back to watch her leave. I walked steadily back toward my private elevator. The grand lobby was finally empty. The silence that filled the massive space was deafening, but as the elevator doors closed around me, it felt incredibly, beautifully peaceful. The federal agent barked sharp, urgent orders to the heavily armed tactical team. The 5-minute warning was an absolute mandate. The wealthy, panicked country club elites violently scrambled for the heavy exit doors, trampling each other to escape the wreckage of the Blackwell family. Patricia was not afforded a discreet exit. 2 stoic female agents gripped her arms tightly and dragged her forward. Handcuffs shattered her high society illusion. She stumbled over her emerald gown, her diamond earrings catching the glare of flashlights. She tried desperately to project an air of indignant superiority, but her smeared mascara and ruined hair made her look completely unhinged. Richard was in worse shape, essentially carried out by his armpits. His tuxedo was torn and stained. He limped pitifully, dragging his heavy right foot, stubbornly refusing to look at the utterly horrified faces of the private equity backers he had spent years courting. Patricia locked eyes with Eleanor, her charity board co-chair of 5 years. "Eleanor, call the governor," Patricia shrieked. "Tell them exactly who we are. We are the powerful Blackwells." Eleanor did not offer comfort. She visibly recoiled, stepping hurriedly backward, staring intently at her bright phone screen to entirely avoid the disgraced matriarch. Patricia screamed, digging her heels in, forcing the agents to drag her. The heavy glass doors slammed shut permanently, cutting off her arrogant demands. The ballroom emptied. Local police pushed the lingering investors into the Chicago night, securing the perimeter. They secured the outer perimeter, standing guard with absolute authority. The chaotic, deafening noise finally faded into a tense, expectant quiet. I remained standing near the acrylic podium. Jamal offered me a respectful nod before walking down the stairs as a free man. Dr. Savannah had already departed, her integrity intact. Only Brittany remained on the wooden platform. She knelt exactly where she had collapsed earlier. A microphone stand had ripped a massive tear down the side of her intricate silver dress. Her evening makeup was completely ruined. She looked around the cavernous room, her chest heaving as the crushing reality of her new situation took hold. Her parents were headed to a federal holding facility in handcuffs. Her husband had publicly abandoned her, handing the evidence of their crimes directly to the FBI. Her bank accounts were frozen, her credit cards were useless. The sprawling Winnetka estate now officially belonged to me. Absolutely everything she had taken for granted was completely gone. She pushed herself up from the floor, her legs trembling visibly. She wiped her nose with the back of her hand, smearing expensive foundation across her knuckles. She turned slowly and looked at me. The arrogant bully I had known for 2 decades vanished entirely. In her place stood a terrified woman, realizing she possessed absolutely no skills to survive in the real world. Brittany took a tentative step toward me, her posture incredibly submissive. She clasped her trembling hands together, initiating a calculated pivot. The vicious adversary instantly tried playing the helpless victim. Sister Brittany whimpered, her voice cracking as she forced fresh tears to well up. "Please, Natalie, you have to help me. I had absolutely nothing to do with the fraud. I did not know what Richard and Mom were doing with the company money. You cannot just leave me here. I have nowhere to go. I do not have a single dollar to my name." I did not flinch. I did not step forward to offer her a comforting embrace. I stood perfectly still, looking down at her from the podium, consciously channeling the exact cold, dismissive energy her mother had weaponized against me on my very first day in their house. I let the silence stretch out, forcing Brittany to stand in the absolute totality of her humiliation. "Quit faking it, Brittany," I said, my voice projecting crisp and lethal across the empty stage. "Enough drama!" She gasped, stepping backward as if I had physically struck her. "But I am your sister," she pleaded, her voice rising in sheer panic. "We grew up together. We shared a roof for years." "We shared a roof," I corrected her coldly, stepping away from the podium. "We were never sisters. You spent your entire life watching your parents treat me like an unpaid servant, and you eagerly joined in the daily abuse. You gladly spent the money they stole from my biological mother's legacy. You laughed when Patricia locked me out of the dining room during family dinners. You happily watched me scrub your floors on my hands and knees while you lived a life of unearned luxury." "Please," Brittany begged, sinking back down to her knees, grasping at the air between us. "You have 2 hands," I stated, my voice echoing with finality. "Get a job in a kitchen." I watched the last remnants of hope drain from her face as I fed Patricia's old, cruel words right back to her. The absolute finality in my tone shattered her desperate attempt for a bailout. She slumped forward, staring blankly at the scuffed floorboards, realizing the free ride was permanently over. I turned my back on her without another word. I looked toward the side entrance where 2 men in dark suits stood waiting quietly in the shadows. They were the private security contractors I had hired through Aegis Med Supply. I caught the lead guard's eye and gave him a short gesture. "Escort her off my property," I instructed smoothly. The guards moved instantly, walking up the stage stairs with purposeful strides. They flanked Brittany, gripping her by the arms and hauling her to her feet. She did not fight them. All the fight had been drained out of her entirely. They marched her toward the exit, her silver heels dragging across the polished floor. I stood alone in the center of the massive ballroom. The heavy oak doors clicked shut behind Brittany and the guards. The stage was completely empty. The silence that settled over the room was deafening, but for the very first time in my life, it was profoundly beautifully peaceful.